Hi there, and welcome to the video. If you're a developer or somebody who likes to create applications, you probably find yourself asking, how am I going to let my users sign in this time for this app? Or how am I going to let my services talk to each other at a platform and system level? This is a common question that teams need to ask themselves and other teams when they're trying to architect the best thing possible. If you haven't heard of SuperTokens, you should definitely check it out because SuperTokens, it's an open source authentication framework with overridable and extensible components that you can use to match your brand style, to match your own flow with a variety of recipes that you can use for a variety of different authentication strategies. When I say recipe, I mean, how do you want to let your users authenticate? It could be a passwordless login, or as we're going to look at today, the classic email and password login that is in almost every single web app out there. Using the SuperToken CLI in just a few minutes, we're going to have an Express.js server that's going to be communicating with a React.js front end. And to have users sign in and sort of verify their identity and stuff, you need a SuperTokens instance. And we're going to be using the demo instance hosted by SuperTokens that everybody can use to explore their SDK. When you're making your own application, of course, you want to sign up with your own email and password, or since it's open source, you can host it yourself, which is one of the beauties of SuperTokens. We're going to start by poking through the UI that comes out of the box with the SuperTokens components to see how the login flow works. And then we're going to hop into the code to actually break down how the backend and front end work together to create this seamless developer experience. Let's get into it. I'm going to start by copying this command that you can find at supertokens.com to invoke their CLI, and it's going to walk us through a variety of steps and ask us some questions. So what is our app called? Let's call it stdemo. Front end do we want? I want React.js. And what backend do we want? I'll take Node. And we're going to use the email password recipe as our demo today. So I'm going to click on that. And this will just install all the dependencies and set up our folder as needed. So sit back and relax. Awesome. The dependencies are installed. So let's cd into our folder and do npm run start. Our web browser is going to automatically open up and boot us straight into the UI so we can start playing with things right away. Open Chrome Developer Tools and head over to the network tab so we can see what's going on. So I'm a new user. I need a new account. Let's head over to the sign up tab. I'm going to put my email address in right here. And you notice the moment I do that, something pops in the network tab. We're getting some exists through. Does this exist? And it's sending it to localhost 3001. And that's our Express server, our Node.js server running in the backend. And does this question of does this email address exist? We don't have to implement that as developers. That comes out of the box with the SuperTokens SDK. My email address does not exist in the SuperTokens demo instance. It's available. So I'm then going to create a password and sign up. Excellent. So upon sign up, we're redirected to this login page and I'm signed in. I'm just going to clear the network tab here so we can have a clean slate and see things a bit easier. So what we're looking at here is an authenticated view. You can't see this unless you're logged in, unless you have an active session, which we got through the SuperTokens SDK. Now you're probably wondering what this call API button does. And it calls an API. It calls a protected API that I can only call if I have an active and authenticated session. This is going to call the /session info root at our API, which is going to return some information about the SuperTokens session that we have in the browser. Let's call this, and we get some session handles, some user ID. This is probably our user ID in the SuperTokens demo instance. And we can see in the network tab, successfully we called this session info root, which returns some data. Now, if you know anything about JWTs, you know that it works with access tokens and refresh tokens. Access tokens are short-lived. They give you access to that resource, and the refresh token is used to mint new access tokens. So let's see how SuperTokens takes care of this whole dance for us by deleting the access token and seeing the refresh token actually go through that flow. We can head over to the application tab, and under cookies, we can go to the domain of our server, and we can see some of the values listed here. Let's click on access token and hit delete to simulate somebody logging out or having your session expire. We're going to call this API again, so let's go over to the network tab and see what happens. When we hit call API, at first it's red, and then it works. We get this box again with our protected information and our user ID and such. Here on this red line, the call to session info failed. We're unauthorized 401, and that's because that access token was deleted. And then you can notice a call to refresh, and this gives us a new access token. It mints us some new validity, and then we can call session info successfully and get through to that API. As a user, when I'm done doing what I want to do, I can just click sign out and I'm redirected to the auth page and my session access token is now deleted. All right, so here I have VS Code open to our ST demo project directory, and you can see that the SuperTokens setup CLI organizes a backend and front end folder really cleanly for us. So we can poke through each of these sections and we're going to see how SuperTokens makes all of this magic happen under the hood. Let's kick it off by looking at the backend with our API Express server, and then we'll hop into poking through the React.js code. Inside the backend folder, we can open index.ts, and this has all of the routes to actually run the API. At the top of the file, we have the SuperToken specific imports that you're going to need, such as the SDK import, something to verify sessions, and something to provide middleware and, handlers to have the /auth, the /logout, and all those routes out of the box so you don't have to implement. Last but not least, we have a helper function and something that actually configures SuperTokens. It's just a dictionary of values. So let's hop into that and see how we set up SuperTokens to talk to the demo instance and set up this idea of an email and password recipe login. In order to configure SuperTokens, you're going to need 3 pieces of information. You're going to need a SuperToken specific configuration object, which is like, where does the SDK talk to? Where is SuperTokens hosted for you? You're going to have some application info about your app, the name, stuff like that. And you're going to have a recipe list, which is, what authentication recipes and strategies do you want your application to employ? So for this demo one, we're going to configure this to talk to the SuperTokens demo instance. We're going to have some demo, application info, very basic stuff. Inside the recipe list is where we specify what libraries we want the SuperTokens framework to use as a whole, such as the email and password authentication set of strategies and sessions, which is going to add some functionality onto the JWTs that SuperTokens actually mints and takes care of for us. And that's really all it takes to configure SuperTokens. Those 3 values and plugging in the specifics that you want. If you desired, passwordless authentication, you would replace what we had earlier with passwordless recipe and it would just work. Okay, so SuperTokens is initialized in Express. What do we do next to have all, the /auth route work, for example? Well, that's the middleware that we're importing on line 5. So we're going to app.use middleware before we define the routes. And this is going to provide all the out-of-the-box SuperTokens paths that we might need. Underneath the middleware, we'll define this protected route that we were looking at in the UI with the call API button, the /session info. Now, if you know Express, you know that you can specify a middleware on the paths right here. So here we have verify session. And this verify session is going to look at the incoming JWT from the browser and say, hey, does this person have authorization to view this route? And that's pretty much all we're going to need on the back end. That 3-step configuration we're going to have using the middleware and verify session on any protected API route that we want. Now let's hop over to the front end and see how we handle the cookies in the actual refresh flow. Opening up the front end folder, we can hop into source app.tsx. Just like with the backend API, we have some SuperTokens initialization before we do anything. And then we'll have something that looks very familiar to anybody who's coded in React. We have the start of React app, and we're going to dig right into this piece by piece. So if you recall in the backend, we needed 3 pieces of information to configure SuperTokens. In the front end, we only need 2. We need some app info, and then we need the list of recipes so the front end actually knows how to talk and authenticate with our backend API. So if we remember from the backend, we were going to use email and password, and we were going to have some sessions in the front end that the backend is going to keep track of. And then we have our application info, which is just that dummy demo information. And there you have it. We have the app info and we have the recipes about how we're expecting to authenticate our users. Let's see how we actually protect the routes on the front end. So just like in the backend where we had an Express.js specific SuperTokens import that allows us to have easy middlewares and paths, we're going to have the same thing in the front end with React. So we're going to start by importing SuperTokens, a SuperTokens wrapper, and we're going to use these below. And then we're going to have our actual session auth that the front end is going to use to store cookies properly and authenticate our API requests. Just like any React app, we're going to make our functional application component here, and then we're going to export it as the default. So let's dig into how this thing is built. We're going to start with the SuperTokens wrapper. Everything is going to go inside of this content. Inside of that, we're going to have a React router, and in there we're going to put our routes for how our web application is defined. Inside of those routes, the first thing we start with is that get SuperTokens routes for React router DOM. Now, this is a very special and important thing. This is going to provide sort of those /auth, that /sign-in, capability, so we don't have to think about it for React and implement it in the router ourselves. Inside of that, we can actually define our first route. And, in the example, we only have one, which is home. It's /. And the element that route's going to hold is going to be a protected element. It's going to be this home component. And you can notice it's wrapped inside of the session auth. Session auth, you can notice, is imported on line 4. This is from the SuperTokens SDK. Anything that you want protected, you just slap inside of session auth, and SuperTokens is going to take care of that for you. If somebody doesn't have a valid session, well, then the get SuperTokens routes for React router DOM is going to say, I know there's a route /auth that we're going to send people to. if they're not authenticated. Send them over there. Inside the home element, if you remember, we had that button, that call API button. So let's take a look at how we actually do the request to call that protected API route. The home component is really just a wrapper for this success view component, and that has all the meat inside of it. So inside of success view, we have the actual call to this button. So I'm going to expand the component, and if we scroll all the way down, you can see call API view. So let's click into that, and you can see we're making an Axios request here to /session info. This is where the magic happened. Where are we passing in any sort of authentication? Nowhere. And SuperTokens SDK takes care of this for us. We have an active session in the front end, and we don't need to worry about refreshing our tokens. We don't need to worry about passing a password. All we need to do is call /session info, and the React hooks are going to take care of passing the information as needed. Wrapping up the front end build just one more time. So we have the SuperTokens config, which has those two pieces of information. We wrap everything in a SuperTokens wrapper with a router, some prefabricated routes, and use a session auth component to protect anything we want. Inside of home, we have a success view with a button that just calls a protected API using Axios, and we don't really need to pass anything extra. It just happens for us. There you have it. You can really have a full authentication going in just a few minutes with this very simple mental model. On the right hand, we have the backend with the middlewares and the prefabricated routes. And on the left hand, we have the SuperTokens wrapper with a protected session auth element inside of a React router. Now, recipes are more powerful than just, giving you some prefabricated steps about how some libraries might interact and provide an authentication strategy. They also provide hooks, so you can interrupt the flow and say, hey, when a user signs up, do this, and you don't have to do some checks manually. This is something you might do on the backend. So let's hop into the backend code. So let's provide some configuration object to this initialization. We're going to provide some overrides to the APIs that SuperTokens has for us. And the API we're going to override is the sign in post. So first we're doing a ... which kind of destructures the existing API information. So we're going to keep everything that is originally there, but for sign in post, what happens afterwards, we're going to take the input and we're going to do some function. So if the response.status is okay, if the user was successfully signed up, then we can do whatever we want. You can use this method to override a variety of APIs, and I urge you to go check out their documentation if you want to see the different ways that you can get creative with it. Go to supertokens.com, head over to their documentation and click on guides. They have these cards that you can pick through and poke through the cards and see, here's email password login. We just went through that one, but they also have password lists, email password and social login. There's a whole host of functionalities and different recipes and overrides that you can explore and really get into. If you guys have any questions, please feel free to reach out. And if you want to see any tutorials or builds in particular, just let us know. Happy learning and stay secure, my friends.